Hey everyone. In this presentation, I want to talk about globalization and what I think are some of the complexities, the social complexities of it. And so we're going to step a little bit away. We're going to keep one foot in economic theory and all, but we're going to take a long step with the other foot into basically some amateur sociology. Okay, globalization. One, it means a lot of things. This is the problem. There's a lot of different aspects to globalization because a lot of processes or systems around the world are globalizing. And what does it mean? I always like to say that, look, globalization has to be distinguished from greater internationalization. And so there has to be some kind of commonality. It can't just be between two separate nations. It globalization in some way has to deal with some kind of overarching common phenomena or aspect, right? So, when we talk about international trade, it's like, okay, yeah, if you build a car in one nation and you ship it to another one, that's international. It's between nations. If build components of the car all over the world, so that the car is itself international. Well, now we talk about a global manufacturing chain or just global distribution and manufacturing. And so, this is what I always say. It's important to keep in mind. But there's a bunch of stuff going on, right? And one thing that I think is important is the number one thing I think about globalization is that there's a process of modernization out there in most countries, and it's not unidirectional. That means it can stop and go backwards and all. But part of the history since 1700s has been modernization of economies and societies, and globalization in some way involves that, or it's going along at the same time with that, right? And that is something that I'm going to focus on. But there are other things. There's increased capital. We have global markets for capital now. And so we have a lot of foreign investors going out there. The increase in trade leads to specialization, countries specializing in certain exports and therefore being open to foreign imports. It includes market integration. And so we have foreign prices. There's a dock strike in Scotland and the oil price in the United States goes up, because it's a global market for oil, right? And so we have foreign, prices shift based on foreign influences. We also have a lot of increasing external discipline, right? That's what economists like to call it. That's the nice way of saying it, but it's foreign influence. You can't just do anything you want in your country, right? And so we have, you know, at a formal level, we have things like the IMF and the World Trade Organization that people join, and those folks say, all right, you got to run things a certain way. And then there's more, informal ad hoc things where a country does something and there's more likely to be a coalition of other countries saying, hey, you can't do that, right? So these are all things, and my point here is just that it's really hard to talk about globalization. When someone talks about it, you get it, well, what do you mean? What kind of globalization? What aspect of it are you talking about? Because it's just a lot of things going on. Now, let me get myself out of the way. I'm going to focus a lot on the social aspects, and kind of my bottom line up front is that the process of globalization, mainly because of that top line modernization, basically dooms traditional society in countries. And this is where a lot of the trouble comes from. And individual cultures are also on the ropes. I mean, they'll survive because there always will be a culture. But by and large, the traditional society is going to be usurped by modernization, which is, almost by definition, because when they talk about different types of societies, a modern society is not traditional, right? So they're antithetical concepts. But this is what a lot of what I'm going to focus on here. So let me come back. Hey, okay. What I mean by modernization, as economies, we're going to take it just economics. This is political economy course, right? when you modernize the society, you are, going, it's basically a change in organization. Now, it often gets discussed in terms of industrial production supplanting agricultural production, right? It's usually seen in those and talked about in those terms. However, the agricultural sector in countries has tended, not all agriculture, in the agriculture sector in the United States is very modern, right? But kind of the historical pattern is that, agricultural sectors were also just basically traditionally organized. What do I mean by that? Mainly along family lines, right? That you had a farm, and it was the family, right? And it was owned by the family, so there was usually a patriarch. These things tend to be patriarchies, could be matriarchies, but they tend to be patriarchies. And the head of the family owned the property, and then everyone in the family worked on it, and eventually they hoped to inherit it. But you have this system, right, of everyone's working within the family. The proceeds of the farm are shared from the family and distributed by the patriarch, right? Now, even large scale plantations, one of the things about those was they tended to be run as large scale families, right? And they took a lot, so the traditional thing is the wealthy tended to have servants or slaves that became like extensions of their family, but not quite so deserving of their share. Right? They were taken care of, and you basically, you were born into this, or you were bought, sold into it. And sometimes when people, when you talk about serfdom, and they're between slavery and family, there were levels of servitude that very often involved you pledging to work for folks, and not having the ability to go look for another job, and not necessarily having a wage. You had your needs taken care of, right? More like a family member, and which was perhaps putting a nice spin on it, but this was the model. The family was the model. The patriarchy was absolutely the model. And so, my point is that you can have non-agricultural businesses organized on these lines very easily. Family stores, to this day, mom and pop stores tend to be that. And you can have really any type of firm, that's what we call, an economic entity that produces something. You can have a firm organized on family lines, and that would be traditional. The modern sector, right? Modern sectors are based on, they tend to be industrial, they tend to produce stuff, but they're organized basically the way we're used to things being organized. Somebody owns the business, maybe a bunch of people own the business, and they hire people, and you get wage-based employment. Now, this is just really important. We go from a system where you get a job, your job is in the family, and you work for your family in some way, and family ties are the currency, right? And you promote people, you're in the organization. Everyone's got standing because they're a member of the family, and they work in the family business, as opposed to a modern firm where, no, you're hired to do a job and you're paid a wage, right? And it turns out, I won't go into all the details, but it turns out this is a way more efficient way of doing things, right? And it tends to have less people involved, and it tends to be way more efficient. Is the key thing, okay? So this is what goes on, right? As you get development, there's this idea that developing nations usually go through a phase. Well, it might be permanent, because you might say there's always traditional stuff, but we talk about there being two sector economies, right? One traditional, usually agricultural sector, and then one growing modern industrial sector, right? This tends to be what goes on in a developing nation, right? Lewis talked about the two-sector model of development. And kind of the idea is that in the traditional agricultural sector, because people, it's just the microeconomics of it, because when you have family members, you don't pay them a wage, you divide up your proceeds amongst them, and you're the patriarch, you get to decide how to do it. And this tends to, you end up over employing people, meaning you have a lot of kids, and you tend to have more people working on the farm than you would if you actually had to pay wages to everyone. And it just mathematically works out this way, okay? The point is, traditional sectors tend to have excess labor, right? And that labor is, in a developing nation, very often the modern sector absorbs the excess labor from the traditional sector. So we get this movement from the traditional sector into the modern. The modern sector has wage-based employment. This is so important because it is going to wreak havoc on the social system. You no longer work for your father, right? And you now work for somebody who's not even in your family. So, one, it diminishes the power that your parents have over you, right? It alienates you a certain to extent, or insulates you, depending on your point of view, from the power of the family. And it elevates somebody who's not a family member to, your employer has a hell of a lot of power over you in life. You've agreed to show up every day and do what they tell you to. And so you sometimes got to tell, I can't, I got to go to work. Mom, I can't talk, I got to go to work, right? This is something that doesn't happen in traditional society. They don't understand that, right? And more than just talking to someone, right? I can't do what you want me to do because my employer, I got to do this other thing. Wage-based employment really changes things. Also, there's a shift to cities, right? This is another thing that's there's just people move in the country where for generations they might not have, right? So this modernization is a buzzsaw for the culture, right? And it's going to really break apart families. It's going to move people around, and it's going to, change things that a lot of people, it might be that you're making more money, but there are going to be a lot of downsides to it that people are going to have trouble with. Now, all right, what's this? How green was my valley? As an example of this, there's a movie from 1941, How Green Was My Valley, and it's about Welsh coal miners. And for a movie in 1941, it's not that offensive. You can be offended at any given point in time in this movie, I'm sure, but it's not that bad. But the point of bringing it up, though, is that it is this nostalgic look at turn of the century Welsh family, and it starts out right. And my big point is, if you watch this movie, it's everything I'm talking about modernization doing, and it's not seen in a good light. Okay, basically the movie starts out with the coal miners, they're getting paid, they're the whole family. Donald Crisp is the father, and there's a bunch of by the way, that's Roddy frickin' McDowell as a kid, right? Roddy McDowell, who probably a lot of you don't even know. He ended up being in the original Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston, and he's a famous actor, and here he is as a child actor. Anyway, the father here is going to they have like 4 other grown sons, right? That's the youngest in the family. You got a bunch of sons, and they have a sister, Maureen O'Hara, who is going to end up in a thing with Walter Pidgeon, but don't worry about that. The point is that it starts out with the coal miners coming back. They've been paid, and because we're Welsh, we sing, and they are singing on their way back to their family, and they come down the hill to their house, and the mother goes out with her apron, and everybody in the family, they've just been paid. They have their shillings in their hands, because pounds aren't in it for these people. They get paid in shillings and pence, and they have their handful of coins, and the mother holds out her apron, and as each man comes in the house, the coins go in the apron, and then she takes it and puts it in a box. And then they wash the coal dust, but we never get the coal dust off. It's very romantic, la la la. But they then, after dinner, because it's like Friday night or whatever, or Saturday night, and because they probably work on Saturday, and the father gets the box with all the money, and everyone lines up in front of him, and he doles out what, each one says what they need, right? I want this, I want that, and they all get a shilling or sixpence or whatever, and eventually Roddy McDowell, who didn't do a damn thing, is in the line, and the father gives him tuppence to spend on something, right? Because everyone needs. And it is actually, it is this beginning, to my mind, was just like, this is the embodiment of from each according to his ability and to each according to his need, which the communists got really into talking about. But when they did that, they were hearkening back to the traditional thing. So here are all these guys, they're living, this is a traditional family. And Donald Crisp runs the house, and the guy, he controls the money and all. Now the point is, throughout the course of the movie, all right, I mean, a lot of stuff happens, right? In this scene, Roddy McDowell, he's been sent to school and he's been beat up, and Donald Crisp is about to tell her that boys must fight, right? It's a very, very different ethics going on, traditional ethics, and he's going to get a boxer in to teach him how to fight. It's like this big thing. But more to the point, as the movie goes on, the family breaks apart and disagreements arise, especially over how to deal with the mine, because they're miners, and the mine company are basically asses, and so there's this big labor thing, and they have a disagreement, and Donald Crisp says, "You can't stay in my house. And if you're going to stay in my house, you'll do as I say." And the sons are like, "Well, no, we're not going to stay in your house, and we want our portion of the box." They demand their wages. And the point is that the family, as the movie progresses, they all break apart, right? And the boys are all by the end of the movie, Roddy McDowell is sitting there with his mother with an atlas showing her where all her sons are, right? And so Ivor is down here in South Africa, and Thomas is in New Zealand, and the other two brothers are in some godforsaken place called Pennsylvania, and they spread out all over the world, and they've lost their but that's I just watched this and go, that is modernization. This idyllic view of the family united around the table, the father in control, everyone doing their role the way the family's supposed to do. The wage-based employment pulls the material foundation of that relationship, which can be very problematic. I'm not, in no way saying this is a good thing, but a lot of people are very, nostalgic about the family having importance and that sort of thing. And you pull the material basis of the system out from under it when you go to wage-based employment. And eventually you also have this idea of, mobility, right? I don't have to work for you, right? Well, I don't, first of all, Father, I don't work for you. I don't have to work for those idiots at the top of the hill, literally at the top of the hill in this movie. I can go to Pennsylvania if I have to. And this is what they do. They go off labor mobility. They each individually seek their own fortunes, and the family breaks up. And by the end of it, they're all alone, and it's very sad. Also, by the way, they destroy the valley. How green was my valley? They don't talk a lot about the environment, but the valley is eventually blighted, as a coal mining valley might be. And so in a lot of ways, it becomes a modern cautionary tale, but it's the way people in 1939, the book was written in 1939, the movie was made in 1941, and it embodies a lot of this nostalgia for the paternalistic past. The roles of women are set, and men are set, and roles of sons and fathers are set, and it's lost, right? It's lost to them all. And my point is, this is our look at this, right? This is a Anglo-Western look at the loss of traditional society. And this is playing out in some form around the world, right? And all people are going to be nostalgic for these things. But I always just felt it was just almost a perfect example of a family that starts out trying to maintain the traditional patterns of living, and then eventually it all goes apart. Now, some of it's good, right? I mean, some of it, Walter Pidgeon is the kind of new progressive minister in the town, and people would shame women, young girls, women, for hanging around with men, and they would, in the church, they would publicly shame them. And Walter Pidgeon fights against that, and there's certain aspects of it that are very, and there's massive class issues, but that's not the point here. Anyway, so the idea, though, is that you see the whole thing falling apart, and it really shows how wage-based employment, every time they stand up, I demand my portion of the box, right? You couldn't do that if it was a farm, right? You'd have to go without anything, and where would you get a job, right? I mean, somebody else's farm. How do you work for them? You can't be. You'd have to marry in. That's what marrying into families was a big deal, right? In the old days. So it really kind of is an example. So that's one thing I want to say. Going to have another cultural. Bear with me. Another cultural example coming up. Okay, I hope you have all seen Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This is a more probably more of you will be familiar with this. And this is just a Christmas thing, right, from the 1950s. And, I look at it, and whenever I've looked at modernization in societies, it's always come up, at some point, I just hear in my head someone saying, I want to be a dentist. And when I look at this show, this little half-hour puppet thing, it's another example. It comes up as, hey, here is modernization hitting a traditional society, and it's portrayed in a very positive way in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And I said, what's interesting is in this is a very subversive tale in some ways, right? Now bear with me on this. What do I mean? The elves are traditional society, right? They're born to the role. They have a group identity as elves. They work for Mrs. Claus. They engage in household production. They all, they make toys for Santa. They don't get wages, right? They all do what they do. They sing in the choir, and they have their role, right? But then we get frickin' Herbie, right? Herbie wants to be a dentist. He doesn't want to do what the family wants him to do, right? He wants to, go study this thing. He wants to specialize, right? And, this is his big ambition. And at the end of the movie, he eventually becomes a dentist. And the show is all about, is about this traditional society really being shaken up, right? Herbie here is, I'm bringing him as the subversive, right? He wants to go, and he's treated as such, right? He's treated poorly at first. Herbie, you can't do that. You've got to, you're an elf. This is what you do. And eventually they let him become a dentist, and then he charges people, right? And, we kind of have this idea of creating a public space, right? Whereas everything used to be done within the family and you all did things. Now he's going to set up shop, and he's going to pull a tooth from some guy, and then he's going to charge him money. And the guy in the little scene where he said, that'll be whatever, 5 cents or 25 cents or whatever he charges him. The guy looks at him shocked. I've never been charged before. So it really changes things. And by the way, Rudolph, for his part, he's technological innovation, a reindeer with that makes all the other reindeer obsolete, right? And once they need him, he kind of he jumps the queue, right? He becomes the lead of the sleigh, right? And indeed, even their traditional enemy is revealed to be nice. And I always say at the end of this show, everything's wonderful, right? Rudolph's leading the sleigh, Herbie's being a dentist, and the abominable snowman's putting the frickin' star on top of the Christmas tree. Everyone's lovely and happy. The thing is, though, that this is not, not the way a traditional society would react to this. they've been torn apart, right? Everything is their old ways are now, blown apart. Uh, the reindeer with the nose, technological innovation has relegated the workforce, or it's kind of weird because they're yeah. But just certain people have their skills or their abilities are no longer as important. And even their sworn enemy is now a friend. I look at it, I say, this is Lord of the Flies about to break loose here, not to mix metaphors. But the point, though, is in our culture, we have embedded in this 1950s thing a story of modernization. We're supposed to accept that people want to do what they want to do. We're supposed to accept innovation and new things. And we teach this to children, right? What a subversive message that is, right? Not just Christmas. Forget, the religious overtones of the whole holiday. Just that message of, people can pursue what they want. And, oh, don't get me started on the land of misfit toys. Okay, let's not even get started on that. The point is, in a child's story, we have a very subversive tale, which now, bringing in an innocent thing like, hey, here's a DVD, here's a story I loved it as a kid, right? You're bringing in ideas that are embedded that we don't realize are there, but are in fact, very modernistic and very challenging to core principles of traditional culture. Do what, serve it, work in your family, do what they say, fulfill your role in life, right? Oh, hell no. I want to be a dentist. And that tears a traditional society up and brings about a new one. And so it's embedded in a lot of our stuff, was my point, is even in this little simple children's thing, here's these values embedded. So what happens, right? And this is my thing. I've got Farm Aid there, and basically from way back in the day, because you get, we saw in the United States the breakdown of the family farm. Basically, that's the modern, continuing modernization of the agricultural sector. And it was not viewed popularly, right? We had Band-Aid, we had a lot of people, Rain on the Scarecrow, Blood on the Plow from John Mellencamp, or he was maybe Cougar Mellencamp at that point, whatever his name was going by. And it caused, my point is, it caused a lot of angst here, right, in the United States at the time. Well, in other countries, where modernization comes in, we're going to get this breakdown of extended families, greater individualism, right? People are going to think, what do I want to do for a living? They are, they're beholden to their family and they're beholden to their employer, which now makes them an individual to balance the two, right? Requires agency on their part, right? Greater materialism. Hey, we got money, we can buy stuff. Competition, right? There might have always been, but there's going to be competition between different people, as opposed to, it's going to take a more overt form in some cases. We're going to end up very often with gender and ethnic equality, because wage-based employment doesn't care who you are, not really. In a modern sector, while individuals might continue to discriminate, the market punishes them for doing it. There is a material cost to hiring somebody who isn't the best person for the job. And very often, traditionally, people have tried to exclude genders, generally women, or various ethnic groups from jobs, and to protect them, a whole apartheid system, for example, and that is not efficient, right? And eventually that breaks down. The market is going to say, no, you hire people, you hire the best person for the job. At wage-based employment creates a material incentive to break down these barriers, and governments will tend to do it too. But again, when you pull the material rug out from under an old social norm, it is a lot more likely to change. Greater uncertainty in the society, labor mobility, people start moving around, moving to cities, so you don't see your children, you barely know your grandchildren, this sort of thing, right? And as a result, very often, anomie, right, which is loss of self, loss of an understanding of the world, is, you know, comes along with all this, right? And so the domestic changes of modernization are horrible in some ways. And just think of all the angst people have had in the United States over various changes, and all of that is happening in other countries, and that's modernization does this, right? Modernization creates these problems, and sure, you get a better standard of living, right? But that's the greater materialism, right? But even there, right, you complain, oh, we're all materialistic. We used to be happy with what we had. So these are not just, my point is, it's not just kind of nostalgic things. It's that modernization is a buzzsaw for a traditional society. It creates a lot of changes. Also, we get foreign influence, right? We get open, and by the way, this photograph here above my head, right? I kind of look like it's a hat, right? I'm wearing it. Those are pumpkins by the Eiffel Tower, right? Halloween jack-o'-lanterns by the Eiffel Tower, and that, Halloween is an American concept, right? And not really a European one. And in fact, the Europeans have pushed back. They have a war on Halloween that they have been off and on fighting since, for a long time. And so globalization brings a lot more overt foreign influences into the world. We get openness to markets, we get new products, we get the consumerism of other cultures creeping in. We get external shocks as things that in other parts of the world have an impact on you that they wouldn't have had without all the market integration and all. And here I'm moving past modernization. I'm bringing in, the integration and all that, markets and all. We get very, very much, when there is a global capital supply, right? When there's a global market for capital, you get a lot of foreign capital, and you start not knowing what capital is. I remember not too long ago, Smithfield Meats, and I'm in North Carolina, and there are a lot of that, a lot of pig farms around. Smithfield's very big around here. Was purchased by a Chinese company, and there was a certain amount of angst about that, and it was this weird company. Most of the company was, a meat producer in China, and it was big in China. But they set up a shell company in Hong Kong that then went out to attract foreign investors from around the world, and they bought Smithfield. And so now Smithfield and this company, they're all owned by this thing. And I kind of looked at it. I said, any part of it, once you create this monster, anywhere, there's no place in the world where it's the home company, right? I mean, as long as you think that Hong Kong is separate in some way from China, it was this really weird, and the owners of it are, who owns it, right? The private investors are from different places. And so capital is increasingly foreign or anonymous, which means you don't know who these people are that you're dealing with, and it creates problems. You have misunderstandings, and people here were very worried about, oh, they're going to send Chinese meat here, and they didn't understand, no, that they wanted the name because they had a lot of quality issues in China, and it was a little bit more complicated. But everywhere there's this, what's the point of the foreign capital, and what's it doing, and a lot of suspicion. Going to have a lot of impact on young people, right? These ideas, there's going to be in all these countries concerns about what the foreign influence is doing on young people. And I remember back in early 2000s, I remember reading about riots or violence breaking out in small towns in India over Hallmark. That they opened Hallmark, greeting cards, just like we have here. They opened up Hallmark stores in the town. And Valentine's Day came along, and the thought of unmarried men and women exchanging love notes was, you know, horrible. And so they were burning Hallmark stores. Wow, Hallmark, um, but here, impact on the young people. And so you get a lot of that there's going to be this concern about foreign influences. And so my point about it is, and I guess the story I bring up here is that there's going to be a lot of guilt by association, right? We see a lot of foreign influences. There will be concerns about them. There will be a lot of influences. There will be also a lot of changes to the society, not necessarily because of the foreigners, all that modernization stuff I'm talking about that is going to come in. It's kind of natural. If you want to participate in the global world, it's just the progression, right, of how we organize, if you want, how things are organized. And that process is not necessarily globalization. That goes on with or without globalization. Globalization might make it go faster, but now that buzzsaw is part of globalization, and we have all these foreign influences, obvious, some of them concerns on their own, but also there at the same time. So guilt by association. We blame the foreigners for this, right? Who are you going to blame for the family breaking down? Well, we can blame the foreigners, right? It's these globalists. Right? And in fact, right-wing populists in the U.S. are doing that. So in other countries, it's a very natural thing to have guilt by association going on. So here's the thing. What are the effects of globalization? I can say it fans the fires of modernization, threatens culture and society. I have this thing, I haven't really, promises wealth but demands obedience. And this is the golden straitjacket concept that, you get wealth, but you have to obey the rules. You have to organize, along the lines, and very much the WTO does this, right? And so we have global rules, right? And, and my point is, like, look, you can't, you've got to have wage-based employment, right? If you want to be wealthy, this is the more efficient way of doing business. You have to, pull labor out of your agricultural sector. You have to modernize your industrial sector. And so this is just how you got to do it, right? And it's kind of like, look, if you want abs, you got to, work on your diet, right? And you make abs in the kitchen, right? It's just kind of like that. Like, this is just the way it works. It's going to create, wildly conflicting political demands to address some of these problems, right? It's going to, at different times, people will want to modernize to achieve better standards of living. At other times, they will react very negatively to Hallmark stores. One example. There was violence. There was, political demands when you have, there were political demands. Hey, you got to either protect the stores or, or, keep them the hell out or whatever, right? You're going to have massive demands coming up to deal with the fallout from all this. It's going, and here's the thing, in a lot of ways, it's going to produce social equality, right? As it's going to tend to produce that, because people who are marginalized in the society now suddenly can work, they're going to work, tends to be that the marginalized people will work for a lower wage. And guess who employers want to hire? Them, right? And so suddenly those people are, every society has a group that is, it's some way oppressed and looked down on. But guess what? That group is cheap. And so the businesses like to hire them, not so oppressed in it, and they work their way up, and so they're going to get jobs and benefit from this. And suddenly they will have power, right? And suddenly they will be valuable. And we're seeing that very much with daughters, farmers' daughters, right? Which was an old time ago, might have been a funny sounding thing to say, but the daughters of farming families, there we go. they are often sent into cities to work in factories, and they suddenly generate income, right? They're not used on the farm, and there's this thing of like, well, especially in India, a lot of times you have to have a dowry and you have to get gold for them, and daughters are often seen as being a drain on the family. But now they can go, you can send them to the city, live with relatives because everyone's got relatives living in the city now, and they can work in a factory and earn money. Oh, that's going to change their position in the society. And we can look at them and say, oh, they're working in a sweatshop, and there are valid labor concerns, but wow, they now have an opportunity they didn't have before. And that's going to change things. Also, we're going to get income inequality. Economies, market economies, they reward risk taking. And people who take risks, a lot of them fail, but a lot of them win. And you tend to get, we get greater wealth on average, but we also get greater income inequality, which then produces discontent, right? Hey, why are they doing better than me, right? So now we got that issue to deal with. Yay. When everyone was poor, it was no big deal, but and so we have discontent coming up because equality. Some people will feel they're better off. Other people, generally the people who used to be the ones who are well off, and thus may have residual political power, are going to feel we're going to feel slighted in some way, and that is a problem. That's going to create things. And like I say, here I gotta get rid of this here. Enables foreign influence and scapegoats, right? So globalization kind of brings foreign influence in. It enables it. It brings it to the fore, and very much creates an opportunity for scapegoating, so that nationalistic reactions can run rampant. And I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot going on with globalization, and there's a lot of scapegoating. And I think a lot of the scapegoating is just scapegoating of modernization, which, is a process that was going to happen. It happened here in the West. It continues to be a problem. And sociologists, talk about it. They'll talk about something called hyper modernization for the most developed countries. But the point is that globalization brings a lot of things in, a lot of influences in, a lot of effects in, some of them extremely profound. And because there's so many moving parts to globalization, the scapegoating or misidentifying the source or the trade-off involved is very likely. There are also likely to be a lot of political demands to mitigate these things, but we have that problem of the obedient, right? You can only go so far because some of these things you need to do, right? And you need to have wage-based employment in a country, and so there's only, what do we do about that, right? How do we, I mean, we've got to have this greater mobility, but people won't like it. And this is what I think I see in globalization, a big furball in many ways, but I see these things going on at different times, and really, in a lot of ways, I think that the effects, the social effects of modernization, not and some of the foreign influences are in and of themselves troubling. All right, so they are their own separate issues, are kind of the big things that become political problems, and that's why it's IPE. And so there you go. I don't know. This is not based on big research, but it's based on kind of just looking at this stuff and what is modernization, and just kind of recognizing some of these things you talk about in an economic model, two-sector economy, wage-based employment instead of family-owned things. And it's like, well, what does that mean, right? Think about the impacts of that, and they can be quite profound.